The Galactic Mercenary Guild operated on a simple principle. If you had enough credits and a pulse, someone would take your contract. The fact that most clients possessed questionable judgment regarding both their finances and their continued existence was merely a feature, not a bug. After all, the galaxy's finest warriors didn't exactly sign up for reasonable assignments with sensible employers. Where was the profit margin in that? 47 floors above the neon-soaked streets of Port Nexus, the Guild's regional headquarters hummed with the sort of bureaucratic efficiency that made root canal surgery seem like a relaxing spa treatment. Processing terminals blinked with incoming contracts while holographic displays cycled through available mercenaries, each bio accompanied by a success rate that would make insurance adjusters weep openly. At Terminal 7 Delta, a weathered human mercenary named Axel Thorne stared at his latest assignment with the kind of expression typically reserved for finding something unpleasant on the bottom of one's boot. 23 years in the protection racket had taught him to read between the lines of client requests, and this particular contract was practically a dissertation in creative omission. "Protect one individual on Kepler 4042c," he read aloud, his gravelly voice cutting through the ambient hum of the processing center. "Duration: indefinite. Threat level: significant. Compensation: 70,000 credits. He paused, scrolling through the sparse details. Additional note: subject may not be cooperative. The understatement of the Galactic Standard Year, no doubt. Uncooperative clients were Axel's specialty primarily because most other mercenaries possessed enough survival instinct to avoid them entirely. Humans, however, had evolved past such inconvenient evolutionary advantages as self-preservation and common sense, making them the galaxy's go-to species for jobs that required someone too stubborn to know when to quit. Kepler 4042c wasn't exactly a vacation destination. Located in the Outer Rim territories, it boasted the kind of frontier charm that tourism boards described as authentic wilderness experience, and everyone else called a good place to disappear permanent. The planet's file listed it as marginally habitable, sparsely populated, and featuring the sort of predatory wildlife that made evolutionary biologists question their career choices. Perfect. Axel's employer for this particular venture was listed as Artemis Holdings, a name generic enough to scream corporate shell company. The contact information led to a sterile office complex where actual humans were as rare as honest politicians. His meeting had been scheduled with someone called Director Hayes, whose bio photo looked like it had been generated by an algorithm designed to create the most forgettable face possible. The director's office resembled every other corporate space in the galaxy: aggressively neutral decor, furniture designed by committees, and the sort of ambient lighting that made everyone look vaguely deceased. Hayes himself proved to be exactly as memorable as his photograph suggested: medium height, medium build, and the kind of practiced smile that suggested he'd learned human emotion from an instructional manual. "Miss Thorne," Hayes began, gesturing to a chair that had clearly been designed by someone who'd never actually seen a human spine, "thank you for taking this assignment. I trust the compensation is adequate." Axel settled into the chair with the fluid motion of someone who'd learned to make himself comfortable in uncomfortable places. "The money's fine. The details, however, are a bit thin. You want me to protect someone, but you haven't told me from what or who or why they're apparently going to fight me every step of the way." The subject is a young woman, early 20s, currently residing in the northern hemisphere of Kepler Fort, fallen in with a dangerous crowd. Her family is concerned for her safety and wishes to ensure her protection until she can be safely relocated. Translation: they wanted him to babysit a runaway who'd probably joined a cult or worse. Axel had handled dozens of similar cases, spoiled colony kids rebelling against corporate parents, usually by embracing whatever local ideology promised the most dramatic opposition to civilized society. The dangerous crowd was probably a commune of aging hippies growing suspicious vegetables and practicing interpretive dance. "What kind of dangerous crowd are we talking about?" Axel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Political dissidents, religious extremists, environmental activists with delusions of significance." Hayes's smile flickered just for a moment before reassembling itself. "The details aren't entirely clear. Our intelligence suggests she's become involved with local elements. The specifics matter less than ensuring her safety." "Right, because clients always hired 70,000 credit bodyguards for vague, unspecified threats." Axel had been in this business long enough to recognize a deliberately incomplete briefing when he heard one. Someone was paying premium rates to keep him in the dark, which meant the real situation was either far worse or far more complicated than advertised. Probably both. Equipment restrictions, Axel inquired, running through his mental checklist of pre-deployment questions. Rules of engagement. Any local authorities I should coordinate with? Standard personal protection equipment should be sufficient, Hayes replied smoothly. As for local authorities, Kepler 42 operates under frontier governance. You'll essentially be operating independent. The family simply wants their daughter safe and away from whatever influences have compromised her judgment. The phrase frontier governance was bureaucratic speak for lawless backwater where the strongest survive and everyone else becomes fertilizer. Axel had worked plenty of outer rim contracts. They paid well precisely because they tended to feature the sort of complications that made standard mercenary insurance policies spontaneously combust. Timeline, he asked. Immediate departure. Transport has been arranged. Hayes stood, clearly considering the meeting concluded. One final note, Mr. Thorne. The subject may attempt to convince you that she doesn't require protection. She's been exposed to considerable propaganda and may genuinely believe she's safe. Your job is to ensure her survival regardless of her cooperation level. Axel accepted the data packet containing his transport details and what little additional intel Hayes was willing to share. As he left the sterile corporate environment behind, he reflected on the cosmic irony that humans, universally regarded as the galaxy's most unpredictable and dangerous species, had somehow cornered the market on keeping other humans alive. The transport to Kepler 42c was a commercial freight hauler, with accommodations that could charitably be described as functional. Axel spent the 3-day journey reviewing what little information he had and preparing for what would undoubtedly be another exercise in creative problem-solving. Uncooperative clients were nothing new, but something about this particular assignment felt different. Maybe it was the deliberate vagueness of the threat assessment. Maybe it was the generous compensation for what should have been a routine extraction. Or maybe it was simply the accumulated wisdom of 2 decades spent in the galaxy's most thankless profession. When clients went out of their way to keep you ignorant, the truth was usually far more interesting than the lie. Kepler 42c greeted Axel with the sort of atmospheric entry that reminded him why most sensible species stuck to civilized worlds with proper spaceports. The freight hauler's pilot, a grizzled Centaurian, whose idea of customer service involved not actively trying to kill his passengers, deposited him at what the navigation charts optimistically labeled as Landing Zone Alpha. In reality, it was a cleared patch of dirt surrounded by enough wilderness to make a survival instructor weep tears of professional pride. Good luck, the pilot called out as Axel retrieved his gear from the cargo bay. Next pickups in 6 standard months, assuming you're still breathing and the local wildlife hasn't developed a taste for human transport vessels. The ship departed with the sort of haste typically reserved for fleeing crime scenes, leaving Axel alone with his equipment and a growing appreciation for the combat pay differential on outer rim contract. The air tasted of ozone and something vaguely organic that his suit's atmospheric analyzer diplomatically classified as biological particulates of unknown origin. Translation: the planet smelled like a gymnasium that had been locked up for decades with the lights off. His first order of business was locating his supposedly helpless client. The data packet had provided coordinates for her last known position, a settlement designated as Grid Reference Tango 7 in the Northern Hemisphere's temperate zone. The fact that someone had bothered establishing a grid reference system suggested at least minimal human presence, though Axel's experience with frontier colonies had taught him that minimal often meant 3 people, a prefab shelter, and delusions of agricultural success. The trek to Tango 7 took the better part of 2 days, during which Axel discovered that Kepler 42c's definition of temperate zone included temperatures that fluctuated between mildly uncomfortable and actively hostile to human survival. His route tracker indicated he was following what might charitably be called a trail, though it seemed designed by someone with a deeply personal grudge against efficient transportation. The local wildlife, meanwhile, had apparently evolved with the specific goal of making human visitors question their life choices. Axel encountered creatures that looked like someone had crossbred a bear with an industrial shredder, birds that flew in formations suggesting military training, and insects large enough to file individual tax returns. His motion sensors picked up dozens of larger life forms shadowing his movement through the dense forest canopy, maintaining a respectful distance that suggested either healthy caution or tactical patience. Professional paranoia was keeping him alive as usual. Grid Reference Tango 7 turned out to be less of a settlement and more of an ambitious camping arrangement. A cluster of weathered structures dotted a natural clearing, connected by paths worn smooth by foot traffic. Solar collectors and atmospheric processors indicated long-term habitation, but the overall aesthetic was less thriving frontier community and more post-apocalyptic hermit colony. Axel approached with the sort of casual alertness that had kept him breathing through 2 decades of protection work. His target was supposed to be a young woman in her early 20s, probably going by an assumed name and likely surrounded by whatever dangerous elements had convinced her family to hire professional intervention. Standard operating procedure called for observation first, identification second, and extraction planning third. What he found instead redefined his understanding of the assignment parameter. She was sitting cross-legged in the center of the settlement's main clearing, surrounded by what his initial threat assessment had categorized as large predatory mammals of significant tactical concern. Closer inspection revealed them to be wolves, or something very much like wolves, if wolves had evolved on a planet where survival of the fittest included an advanced degree in creative violence. 8 of them formed a loose circle around her, each specimen easily twice the size of their Earth cousins and built with the sort of functional musculature that suggested they'd never encountered a prey animal that survived first contact. Their coats ranged from midnight black to silver gray, and their eyes held the kind of intelligent assessment that made Axel's professional instincts start composing resignation letters. The woman appeared to be having a conversation with, not the sort of one-sided dialogue that lonely humans sometimes conducted with pets, but an actual exchange involving vocalizations from both parties. She would speak in low, measured tones, and individual wolves would respond with what sounded suspiciously like deliberate communication rather than random animal noises. When she gestured toward the forest's edge, several of them turned to look in that direction with obvious understanding. Axel remained hidden in the tree line, recalibrating his threat assessment and wondering if Artemis Holdings had neglected to mention their target's apparent descent into madness. Talking to wild animals was typically the sort of behavior that preceded either a complete psychological breakdown or a Darwin Award ceremony, sometimes both simultaneously. Then one of the wolves looked directly at him, not in his general direction or toward the movement in the underbrush he might have caused. The creature locked eyes with him across 50 meters of wilderness with the sort of precision that suggested it had known about his presence long before he'd spotted the settlement. Its gaze held the kind of calculating intelligence that made Axel reassess both the local wildlife and his own tactical situation. The woman followed the wolf's line of sight, turning to face his position with a smile that managed to be both welcoming and deeply unsettling. "You might as well come out," she called, her voice carrying easily across the clearing. "They've been tracking you for the past 3 hours, and the suspense is making everyone nervous." Axel emerged from the tree line with his hands visible and his sidearm holstered, employing the sort of non-threatening body language that had served him well in previous encounters with potentially unstable clients. "I'm looking for someone," he said, maintaining conversational distance while keeping track of the wolves' positions. "Name's Axel Thorne. I'm here on behalf of your family." Her laugh held genuine amusement rather than the manic edge he'd been expecting. "My family sent a bodyguard." That's either touching concern or spectacular irony, depending on your perspective. She stood with fluid grace, and the wolves shifted position to accommodate her movement without apparent coordination. "I assume they told you I was in terrible danger and needed immediate rescue." "Something like that," Axel replied, noting that none of the predators showed any signs of aggression despite his presence. If anything, they seemed curious rather than threatened, though I'm starting to think the briefing materials might have omitted some relevant detail. "Most briefing materials do," she said, approaching with the sort of confident stride that suggested she'd never encountered a situation she couldn't handle. "Let me guess. Mysterious corporate representatives, vague threats, generous compensation, and strict instructions not to take no for an answer." The accuracy of her assessment was either impressive intuition or concerning foreknowledge. "You've been through this before." "Third time this year," she said cheerfully, "though you're the first one who made it past the outer perimeter without requiring medical evacuation. The wolves are impressed. They were expecting to have you treed within the first hour." Axel glanced at the 8 predators, who were now observing their conversation with what could only be described as amusement. "These are your pets. Partners," she corrected, though they'd probably dispute the classification system entirely. "Wolves don't really subscribe to human concepts of ownership or hierarchy. They prefer collaborative arrangements based on mutual benefit and shared objectives," which explained absolutely nothing while raising several dozen new questions. Axel decided to focus on his immediate professional obligations, rather than the philosophical implications of interspecies diplomacy. "Regardless of your current living arrangements, I have a contract to ensure your safety.
Your family believes you're in danger. My family, she said with the sort of tone typically reserved for discussing chronic medical conditions, believes a lot of things that don't align with observable reality. The question is whether you're here to fulfill their expectations or discover the actual situation. The largest of the wolves, a massive silver-gray specimen that looked like it could bench press a shuttle, approached with deliberate casualness. It stopped just outside Axel's personal space and fixed him with the sort of direct stare that suggested it was conducting its own threat assessment. After several seconds of mutual evaluation, it made a sound that was part growl, part vocalization, and entirely unlike anything in Axel's experience with Earth canines. He says you smell like someone who's seen real combat, the woman translated with apparent seriousness. Also that your equipment suggests you actually know how to use it, which puts you ahead of the last 2 rescue attempts. Axel stared at her, then at the wolf, then back at her. You're telling me this animal just gave me a professional evaluation? Alpha's always been a good judge of character, she replied. 20 years of mercenary work, right? Mostly protection contracts with a few extraction jobs when the pay was worth the moral ambiguity. The fact that a wild animal had apparently summarized his career history with disturbing accuracy was the sort of development that made Axel question either his sanity or his sobriety, possibly both. This, he said with the weary resignation of someone whose job had just become significantly more complicated, is going to require some explanation.
The explanation, as it turned out, was the sort of story that made Axel's previous assignment seem refreshingly straightforward by comparison. Her name was Echo, whether by birth or adoption. She hadn't specified, and her background read like a case study in corporate family dysfunction, with a side order of genetic tampering that would make ethics committees spontaneously combust. My father runs biotech development for Helix Industries, she explained over a meal that consisted of local vegetation and what appeared to be voluntarily donated protein from the local ecosystem. Specializes in enhancement projects for extreme environment colonization, the sort of work that requires extensive testing on volunteer subjects. Axel paused in his consumption of something that tasted like chicken but looked suspiciously like it had once possessed too many legs. Volunteer subject, that's the official terminology, Echo said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The reality is somewhat more complicated. Helix has been developing enhanced human variants for frontier colonization, improved reflexes, enhanced sensory processing, accelerated healing, that sort of thing. The kind of modifications that make someone ideally suited for survival in hostile environments. The pieces were starting to form a picture that made Axel's professional paranoia sit up and take notice. You're telling me you're genetically modified? 3rd generation, she confirmed cheerfully. My grandmother was part of the initial test group. My mother was 2nd-gen refinement, and I represent the theoretical pinnacle of human adaptation enhancement. Faster, stronger, more resilient, and with sensory capabilities that make baseline humans seem functionally disabled by comparison. Which explained how she'd survived alone on a hostile frontier world, but raised several dozen new questions about why her family wanted her retrieved. Enhanced humans were typically corporate assets of considerable value, the sort of investment that companies protected rather than abandoned on backwater planets. Alpha made another of his complex vocalizations and Echo nodded in response. He wants to know if you're planning to complete your contract or if you're starting to understand why that might be problematic. I'm starting to suspect, Axel said carefully, that my contract details were somewhat incomplete. What exactly does your family think they're rescuing you from? The dangerous crowd I've fallen in with, Echo said, gesturing toward the pack. Though from their perspective, that's probably an accurate assessment. The wolves had initially treated Axel with the sort of wary tolerance typically reserved for potentially dangerous strangers. Over the course of several hours, however, their attitude had shifted toward something resembling cautious acceptance. The smaller members of the pack had begun investigating his equipment with obvious curiosity, while the larger ones maintained watchful positions that suggested they were prepared for trouble but not expecting it. Echo's explanation for this behavioral shift was characteristically unsettling. They're evaluating your potential for integration. Wolves are pragmatic about survival. If you're going to be around, they want to know whether you're an asset or a liability. Integration into what exact? The pack, she said, as if this were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. These aren't ordinary wolves, Axel. They're the result of the same enhancement programs that produced me, just applied to a different species. Enhanced intelligence, improved communication capabilities, and social structures that make human military units look disorganized by comparison. The implications hit him like a freight shuttle to the cerebral cortex. Enhanced wolves meant enhanced capabilities, enhanced loyalty, and enhanced lethality directed by enhanced intelligence. No wonder corporate interests wanted Echo retrieved. She wasn't just a valuable genetic asset, she was commanding a squad of the most dangerous predators in known space. So when my employers described you as being in danger, Axel said slowly, they were actually concerned about the danger you represent. Bingo, Echo said with obvious satisfaction. A genetically enhanced human with command authority over a pack of similarly enhanced apex predators, living completely outside corporate oversight on a planet with no legal infrastructure. From their perspective, I'm either an asset to be recovered, or a threat to be neutralized. The pack's acceptance of his presence suddenly took on new significance. They weren't just tolerating him, they were recruiting him. The realization should have been terrifying, but Axel found himself oddly flattered by their professional assessment of his capability. What exactly happened to the previous rescue attempts? He asked. Echo's expression grew thoughtful. The first team tried a straightforward extraction approach. Military contractors with standard corporate authorization and a mandate to retrieve me by any means necessary. They lasted about 6 hours before the pack convinced them to reconsider their career choices. Convinced them how? Wolves are excellent at nonverbal communication, she said diplomatically. The second attempt was more subtle. A single operative with falsified credentials claiming to represent humanitarian interests. He made it 3 days before Alpha figured out he was carrying tracking devices and military-grade restraint equipment. Axel considered this information while watching the pack move through their evening routines with the sort of coordinated precision that would make Special Forces units weep with envy. Enhanced intelligence meant enhanced tactical capability, and enhanced tactical capability applied by apex predators was the sort of force multiplier that redefined entire battlefields. And now they've sent someone with enough experience to recognize when a situation is more complex than advertised, Echo corrected. The question is what you're going to do with that recognition. Alpha approached their position and settled beside Echo with the casual ease of a longtime partner. Up close, Axel could see the intelligence in the animal's eyes, not the cunning of a predator, but the calculating assessment of someone conducting strategic evaluation. The wolf studied him for several long moments before making a series of vocalizations that sounded suspiciously like questions. He's asking about your long-term career plans, Echo translated. Specifically whether you're interested in permanent employment with better benefits and more interesting work than standard corporate contracts. The wolf is offering me a job. The pack is offering you membership, she corrected. There's a significant difference in terms of both expectations and survival prospects. Axel looked around the clearing at 8 enhanced predators, 1 genetically modified human, and a frontier world that operated by its own rule. His contract specified protecting the client, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the client neither needed nor wanted protection from anything, except corporate interference. What exactly would pack membership entail? He heard himself ask. Echo's smile was the first genuinely warm expression he'd seen from her. That depends on what skills you bring to the group dynamic. But given your background and the pack's current strategic assessment, I'd say you're looking at a significant promotion from your current position. Alpha made another vocalization that sounded almost like laughter. He says, Echo translated, that anyone crazy enough to take a contract on Kepler Force. The benefits package, as it turned out, included a front row seat to the sort of corporate scheming that made galactic politics look like a friendly neighborhood disagreement. Axel's contemplation of career alternatives was interrupted by the pack's early warning system, a network of enhanced sensors that made military surveillance equipment seem quaint by comparison. We have company, Echo announced, rising from her position with the fluid grace of someone whose reflexes had been optimized for combat scenarios. Multiple aircraft, military configuration, approaching from the south. Estimated time to arrival 12 minutes. The pack responded with the sort of coordinated efficiency that would have impressed drill sergeants across the galaxy.
Within seconds they had dispersed to defensive positions while maintaining visual contact with each other through a communication system that operated entirely below human hearing range. Alpha remained beside Echo, but his posture had shifted from relaxed companionship to tactical readiness. "Let me guess," Axel said, checking his equipment with the automatic precision of professional habit. Artemis Holdings decided to upgrade from single operative retrieval to full extraction team. "Worse," Echo replied grimly. "Those are Helix Industries which means my father decided to stop pretending this was a family intervention and start treating it as asset recovery." The distinction was significant in ways that made Axel's survival instincts start filing emergency reports. Corporate family dysfunction was one thing. Helix Industries conducting military operations on frontier worlds was something else entirely. The sort of something else that typically ended with unmarked graves and classified incident reports. "How many enhanced assets does Helix have in active deployment?" he asked, running tactical calculations that were becoming increasingly unfavorable. "Officially, 12 active field units, each consisting of 4 to 6 enhanced operatives with specialized equipment and authorization for lethal force." Echo's expression suggested the official numbers were optimistic. Unofficially, they've been expanding the program for the past 3 years. Current estimates put their enhanced personnel roster somewhere around 60 individuals. Alpha made a sound that was probably profanity in whatever language enhanced wolves used for expressing professional displeasure. The sentiment was understandable. Even 8 enhanced predators with superior local knowledge faced unfavorable odds against a corporate military unit equipped for asset recovery operations. "What's the extraction protocol for someone in your situation?" Axel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Depends on their current objectives," Echo said with the sort of clinical detachment that suggested she'd given this considerable thought. "If they want me functional, it'll be tranquilizer rounds and restraint systems designed for enhanced humans. If they've decided I'm too much of a liability to recover intact, it'll be termination authorization with genetic material preservation for future development." The approaching aircraft were close enough now that Axel could hear their engines, the sort of high-efficiency turbines that corporate military units used for operations where stealth mattered less than overwhelming firepower. His motion sensors indicated multiple heat signatures, suggesting a full tactical team rather than a simple retrieval unit. "What about the pack?" he asked. Echo's smile held the sort of cold satisfaction that made Axel reassess her threat level upward by several categories. Corporate planners have a tendency to underestimate non-human assets. They're expecting to deal with a single enhanced target and some trained animals. They're not prepared for coordinated resistance from a unified tactical unit with superior environmental knowledge. The first transport crested the forest canopy and began circling the settlement in a pattern that suggested professional military training. Axel counted 6 aircraft total, each carrying what appeared to be a full squad of enhanced operatives. The odds were worse than unfavorable. They were approaching mathematically impossible, which was when Axel realized he'd been thinking about the situation entirely wrong. His contract wasn't to extract Echo from danger, it was to protect her from threat. The corporate extraction team represented exactly the sort of threat his professional obligations required him to address. The fact that fulfilling his contract meant joining a pack of enhanced predators in combat against his original employers was simply an interesting example of how complicated military contractors made everything. "Alpha wants to know if you're staying or leaving," Echo said, translating another of the wolf's complex vocalizations. "The pack's about to demonstrate why corporate asset recovery teams should stick to laboratory environment." Axel drew his sidearm and checked his ammunition supply with the sort of practiced efficiency that had kept him alive through 2 decades of protection work. "Tell him I'm curious to see how enhanced wolves handle urban combat tactics." "They're not urban combat tactics when you're fighting in a forest," Echo pointed out with obvious amusement. "Out here, corporate training is a liability rather than an asset." The first transport began its landing approach, and Axel got his first clear look at the extraction team. Enhanced humans in military-grade armor, carrying weapons designed for neutralizing enhanced targets, and operating with the sort of professional competence that suggested extensive experience in asset recovery operations. Unfortunately for them, they were also operating in an environment where human military doctrine was poorly suited to the tactical realities of pack hunting behavior. Alpha's howl echoed across the clearing, not the wild call of an ordinary predator, but a complex communication that triggered immediate responses from positions throughout the forest. The sound was answered by 7 other voices, each from a different direction, creating an acoustic map of coordinated positions that made the corporate team's landing zone selection look increasingly problematic. The pack's been preparing for this possibility for months, Echo explained as the first operatives began deploying from their transports. Enhanced intelligence includes enhanced strategic planning. They've turned this entire forest into a tactical nightmare for conventional military units. The opening engagement lasted approximately 90 seconds and redefined Axel's understanding of asymmetric warfare. Corporate operatives trained for urban combat and laboratory environments found themselves facing opponents who had evolved specifically for forest hunting scenarios. Enhanced wolves moving through familiar terrain with coordinated tactical intelligence proved to be the sort of force multiplier that made advanced military equipment irrelevant. When the shooting stopped, Axel found himself surrounded by 8 enhanced predators, 1 genetically modified human, and several dozen pieces of very expensive corporate military equipment that would never file another mission report. The extraction team's surviving members were retreating toward their remaining functional aircraft with the sort of haste typically reserved for natural disasters. Well, Echo said cheerfully, that was education. Alpha approached Axel's position and made a vocalization that sounded distinctly approving. The wolf's assessment was apparently shared by the rest of the pack, who had begun treating him with the sort of casual acceptance typically reserved for established team members. He says you're officially pack now, Echo translated, though he's recommending a probationary period until you learn proper forest tactics. Axel holstered his weapon and looked around at the clearing where he'd just participated in what was probably the most successful asset protection operation of his career. His contract had been to protect Echo from threats, and corporate extraction teams definitely qualified as threats. The fact that completing his assignment had resulted in pack membership with enhanced predators was simply an interesting example of how frontier work never went according to plan. What's the pack's retirement plan, he asked. Echo's laughter was the sort of sound that suggested she'd found someone who finally understood the joke. Retirement is when you stop being useful to pack survival. Given current corporate interest in our continued existence, that's probably going to be a very long time from now. Alpha made another vocalization that Echo didn't bother translating, though his expression suggested amusement at the entire situation. The galaxy's most unpredictable species had once again demonstrated why sensible civilizations hired them for impossible jobs. They were too stubborn to recognize when situations were hopeless, and too adaptable to let inconvenient facts interfere with successful outcomes. Somewhere in the corporate offices of Artemis Holdings, Director Hayes was probably explaining to his superiors why their asset recovery operation had resulted in equipment losses, personnel casualties, and the addition of a professional military contractor to an already problematic resistance. The irony, Axel reflected as the pack began their evening patrol routines, was that they'd finally succeeded in providing Echo with the protection she actually needed, just not in the way anyone had originally planned.